crucial distinction in the concept of experience. I think this is important when dealing with reification and actually reading Adorno, Benjamin, and the Frankfurt School especially. So there's Erlebnis is like the French vécu, lived experience. And Sartre, uses this. This is actually lived experience. And it's a vivid, strong experience, if you will, and obviously part of subjectivity. So Erlebnis, or aliveness, right, is really the correct pronunciation. The other category, and this is playing off, right, and this could be the subjective experience that Lukacs speaks to. And we'll come back to this when we get to existential Marxism, too. So I want you to keep this in mind when we get to Sartre's existential Marxism. And really, in some senses, Lefebvre's lived experience of the everyday. He's a problematizer of the everyday. This is very crucial in this thing. The other one is Erfahrung. It's a neutral category insofar it's knowledge or experience and really, better put, expertise. It's kind of an expertise. So when Lukacs speaks about specialization and over-specialization and the division of labor, I think this is what he's really referring to as this Erfahrung, which is really gained over a long time. It's a specific experience too, and leads to specificity. And in some ways, the Erfahrung also is related somewhat to the outside in history of the object world of the Gegenstand. The Gegenstand, which is objectivity in general from the outside in Lukacs' thing. Whereas this is the subject-object relationship more as we know it, right? This Erlebnis, lived experience with the world of objects. So one is coming from the outside, from the exterior, completely, whereas this is coming more and more from within, right, in some ways. So this is a specific knowledge, and it's also gained over a long period of time. So you could say this has more of a, if you will, a perspectival component to it. There are Erfahrung, right? It has more of a perspectival. So when we begin to speak of objectivity, we're really talking about Erfahrung. And so Husserl, for example, the way we make judgments are through Erfahrung, a longer period of time instead of these, quote, subjective impressions or experiences. So anyway, I wanted to do this because, when Lukacs begins to talk about externalization, objectification, vis-a-vis alienation, alienation can be an experience, right? The division of labor can be a personal experience. However, he's really talking about this much more objectively in the notion of Erfahrung as experience. And this is one of the reasons I think Marxists have a hard time, at least in the tradition, of talking about experience, right? That, so many people say experience, it's been my experience, right? Something like that. It doesn't really broaden itself out to the more generalized categories of the totality of social relations. So that's where I'm really trying to go with this, if this makes sense. Any questions? I mean, I just thought this would be a good little, philological, translation, a moment that may elucidate a little greater what Lukacs is up to vis-a-vis experience. We're going to get this later with Sartre, in existentialism, that Lukacs is incapable of reading Heidegger, even though he not incapable, doesn't want to read Heidegger because of the Dasein and the subjectivity. So we're going to see this at work in Sartre's Search for a Method, which I plan to do maybe part of on December 1st and then the 8th with Henri Lefebvre. So anyway, Heidegger wrote a thing on Hegel's concept of experience. So this is a German thing, right? Also Hegel, the lived experience of the immediate reality that is unmediated, right? Whereas the Erfahrung has many levels of mediation to it. So again, this is connected to the Aufhebung and to levels of mediation in Hegel, right? Okay? So that makes sense. All right. So, yeah, and this is also, you gain something here, even though this is purely subjective. This can be positive or negative as part of the experience too. There can be a positive objectivity and a negative objectivity as well in terms of the Erfahrung. Yeah. The word German, Urteil, by the way, literally means to separate. Judgment is really a separation. It's a process of separation. Yeah, in a way. And you can see this like in Freud too, separation anxiety. You have to make the judgment whether you're going to separate or not, or if the anxiety overwhelms you so much that you're thrown into, this kind of agglomeration of, impressionable immediate experiences, right? It's an interesting, the German language, even though I'm much more partial to the French and, the Romance languages, etc. The German language is our philosophical language, like it or not, of our century. And, this is what Marx wrote in, this is what Lenin read in, in philosophy. Mao read Marx in German, right? So,
Freud and Jung, they wrote in German, didn't they?
Freud and Jung both wrote in German, yeah. One being Swiss German, the other one from Moravia, from now Czechoslovakia, right? Marx from Trier. Yeah, Trier. Right. So anyway, okay. So I want to go back now to the Lukacs, just to kind of tie it. Did you have any questions or thoughts about this? I know we, did some work on the concept of the totality last week. I'm just wondering, any strange passages or questions that you might want to ask or problematize or commentary? I mean, yeah, please.
Well, not so much on the totality thing,
Yep.
because I do think that's different, but
Yeah.
my sort of general experience with the economic manuscripts and then with Lukacs
Right.
has just been, this is all just the commodity fetishism chapter from One to Capital. I'm not seeing a lot new.
Right, I agree with you, yes. However, it is the first attempt, it's seminal in the historical record, if you will, or in the archive, to really actually do a commentary and do it in such specificity. Yes, I agree with you. However, he brings up terms like, calculative rationality, mechanized rationalization. These are all kind of crucial concepts for us today, and I think he's beginning to look at this in the light of 1922, capital and finance capital, of course, and whereas Marx, when he's writing in 1844, it's just on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. So to be a little more historically specific to the terms, I think it's important to, to keep that in mind. But I agree with you. This is a long commentary, and I wrote this for the notes on the website for the day. I wrote them last night, unfortunately, but they didn't go up today through my fault. Anyway. That this is a commentary on Volume 1, as you just pointed out, on the commodity and the fetishistic character of commodities. Yeah, and this is where Lukacs is really located. But I like the way he does it through philosophical terminology. See, he's the first to really get beyond almost the mechanistic vulgar approach because his antagonists are Dubrovin and Rodas in the Soviet Union, Plekhanov, who was Lenin's philosophy teacher, etc. So there is an attempt to go well beyond this mechanical Marxism of the time. And the totality is one moment that he really contributes, as
Yeah,
a
the
different
totality
section.
seems a
Yeah.
totally new thing.
Yeah.
From what
Okay. So you're basically saying that reification is not so new as a term and whatever, the phenomenon.
I was thinking, like, why is this such
Right.
influential
Right.
bullet points? Like,
Right.
we already had this from 1867 onward.
Right, no, that's very true, although Marx doesn't, put it into terms of, how this would work in terms of the class consciousness of the proletariat. So his intention here is we're just reading the phenomena itself. We're reading actually, as you very rightfully pointed out, a commentary on the economic and philosophical manuscripts that basically is a summary of that with a little bit of a different language, and I mean some of the different language is, pages, and I mean, maybe I'm not doing this justice by not having us read all of it, but there's only so much time in the day. I mean, this is a 150-page essay that goes further and further. So I think what he's really trying to do that's new is show the contemplative attitude at work, right, in reification. That, and he's also arguing with the bourgeois economics, of the day, etc. And he's also trying to, I think, to broaden the concept of reification back to the totality, that what has happened is that very few people are reading both forces and relations of production together. They're not being read in a parallel fashion. So I think that's one thing that he's adding to this discourse. And I'm just going to point out, this is later, I would suspect most of you at least have a mimeographed, a photocopy of the essay. He does go on later on, later in the section, first of all, the antinomies of bourgeois thought through Kant. So he's the first to really read the Kantian, critique of pure reason in the light of class consciousness.
Is this later in the book?
Yeah, it's later in the essay. We're just reading, unfortunately, I just thought we should, have the notion of the phenomenon of reification. The next section is called, it's based in 3 parts, the antinomies, of bourgeois thought, right? And this is very original, although it's about 90 pages and it's very, very dense, and would take, probably 3 to 4 or 5 weeks just to decode, right? I think, I remember the first time I did a study group on this, many years ago. We spent literally, at least 6 weeks just on this section. So, anyway, but I mean, feel free to read it, and maybe what I'll do is I'll reread this section and maybe, give us a lead in to Sartre. Because this, again, is the classic book. I want to emphasize, and one of the reasons I chose it, I mean, I may not have chosen the phenomenon of reification, but it was to follow the economic and philosophical manuscripts. But this book is seminal in terms of Marxist philosophy, because this is the book that launched Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer. They all refer to this book. This was the book that kind of broke the camel's back. This is 1922, well before Negative Dialectics, between social science and philosophy of Horkheimer, before Benjamin did the Coming program in philosophy. All of this was early. And even Benjamin in 1924 read this and said this is what introduced him to Marxist philosophy. So I'm not trying to sell you on it, but at another level, he goes through, there are 3 parts here. So the antinomies of bourgeois thought, the whole essay is called Reification and Class Consciousness of the Proletariat, and then the last section is basically the consciousness of the proletariat, right? So he's really trying to establish, in German, the Bewusstsein, the consciousness of the subject of history at this point, right? This is the notion. How do you create a subject of history? I mean, I'm convinced that Engels invented the proletariat. The condition of the working class in Manchester is the invention of the modern proletariat. That's where the term really comes from. Yeah. and the Columbia. You may know Stephen Marcus, Chris. Do you know
I've
Stephen
read- yeah.
Marcus? Yeah. Stephen Marcus wrote a very good literary attempt. You know Stephen Marcus's work on it? Yeah, it's a very good approach to the conditions of the working class in England. Yeah, and as most of you know through the movie, Engels liked to go slum. He's the son of a, I'm sorry I use that term, but it's really true. From his perspective, what he did, right? He went out into the Irish working class neighborhoods and he found his wife there. That's right. His only wife between the, 5 other, but anyway, that's another story. Yeah. But anyway, So I'm sorry to use that term, but that's what they used to call it during that period, right?
Not just in that period.
Not just in that period, they still use it?
Slumming tour.
Is that a movie you said? What
It-
movie?
The
Young
movie is The
Marx.
Young Marx by Raoul Peck, and
Yeah.
it has a very, have you guys seen it?
I went-
Yeah,
It's good.
there's a nice sequence of Engels
went to-
going down and getting, shit kicked out of him. Yeah, by one of the guys there,
wanted
and
to
then
see it
waking
again. I
up
went to
to
the
the
Mexico
angel
rep.
of history,
Yeah, we
Mary
did too.
Hawkins.
Yeah.
Well, he
It's
followed
easy
Mary
for me to
the,
get to the,
There.
easier there than here I have
to the
to.
Dan or wherever it was.
Yeah, that's
I
right,
think it
that's
was one
right.
of the
So it's
brothers.
interesting, but so this is
Yeah.
where the proletariat was really
I can see it
invented,
again now.
theoretically, not that it didn't exist. I mean, the empirical was there, but the obvious thing was that, if Frederick Engels hadn't probably gone down to that part of town, right, we wouldn't have the term. Maybe we would have had it. We would have had it from Rick Wolf's great-grandfather, Wilhelm Wolff, to whom the volume 1 of Capital is
What is
dedicated.
the etymology?
He was
It's
down
from
there,
Greek,
too.
not Latin. Proletariat is from
Proletariat is Latin,
Greek. Latin?
those without property.
Oh.
Yeah, proletariat. No, the Greeks didn't have a notion. Greeks were into allotments and demes. They didn't have a notion of property, so to speak. You had allotments, right? Makes sense, right? Yeah, proletariat, yeah, please.
Last
Yeah.
week when in class, I was confused about
Okay.
exactly what you brought up, and I was like, what exactly is the difference anyway between commodity fetishism and reification? But I don't know if this is being reductionistic, but
No, it's okay.
is somehow reification more the alienation from labor itself, not just of the product of the object
And
of labor?
understanding that in terms of labor power and labor
Right.
processes. Because what Lukacs is really trying to do is show that reification is permeating everyday life.
exactly.
It really permeates
Right.
all of everyday life. And that this is the beginning of the structure of the commodification of the individual. That there is no such thing as the
Right.
individual, the subject, etc. In
He's
this case.
reifying commodity fetishism, basically. Reification is a reification of commodity fetishism to the subject itself.
Well, reification is this experience that's both long-term, right?
Yeah.
It's coming in terms of how one is objectified by the outside, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm talking
In some ways.
etymologically of the term reification is kind of like an entrenching or like a further ingraining of this idea as well.
Well, reification literally means it's kind of like a philosophy of as if so-and-so was the case. So
What is
this is
the
what he's really doing is taking apart all the as-ifs.
Right.
This is the case. That David was happy making that beautiful jewelry for you. Right? Maybe he was, but we don't know, until it was, in the factory,
I think
right?
so.
The mass-produced, et cetera, in a sense. The reification,
Am I right? I think reification, the first part of it comes from the Latin word res, which
Yeah,
means
Thingification, yeah, you
Yeah.
become the thing.
You become
Yeah.
a thing
Yeah,
instead
yeah.
of
Yes, that's right.
whatever.
That's right.
Instead
Yeah,
of
it's thingification,
Yeah.
soul,
objectification.
I mean, in the
He's going
Aristotelian
beyond
soul,
the
you're no longer a
alienating
soul, you're a
processes
thing, an object.
that Marx speaks to. But Marx also speaks, and you're right, of objectification. Yeah, in a sense, that we become thing-like. We become commodified. We're no longer, quote, human. We're no longer species being anymore,
Right.
Because the world itself is the world of capital, the world of commodities, and the fetishism. That's the transformation. So he's doing a commentary on this. The reification, yes, is the thingification, right? And also the as-if. I want to emphasize the as-if as a parallel because you think as if such and such was a case. right? Yeah. As if, oh, you produced that, that's great, but you don't see any of the relations.
Right.
They go, that's what he's really trying to do. He's trying to unmask, if you will, and undo all these processes that lead up to, commodity, and looking at it through, again, forces of production, innovation, new stuff, right, et cetera, that's being produced, where the force of, and how this affects the relations of production. So he's working in both domains, always, which he claims against his historical antagonists or the mechanical Marxists who just want to center on forces of production changing, not the relations, right? They want to just say history is the story of the haves and the have-nots only, right? And there's no in between, this kind of thing. So he's going against, if you will, this mechanical Marxist tradition. And also against the Social Democrats. Another reason it's worth reading, there's a whole section on Max Adler in the concept of the totality. That the social, and this is a lesson for today, for our time, I don't mean just for us here in this room, but he talks about this on page 11. I'll repeat this from last week. What was good faith in Ricardo became a consciously misleading apology of bourgeois society in the writings of the vulgar Marxists. The vulgar Marxists arrived at the same results by seeking either the thoroughgoing elimination of dialectics from proletarian science, right? Or at best its critical, refinement. To give a grotesque illustration, and this is one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, Max Adler wished to make a critical distinction between dialectics as method, as the movement of thought on one hand, and the dialectics of being, or metaphysics, on the other. So Lukacs is talking about the separation between thinking and being, right? Which is not dialectical, right? Right? It's not dialectical at all. And this is what the Social Democrats do. His criticism culminates in the sharp separation of dialectics from both, and he describes it as a piece of positive sciences, which is what is chiefly meant by talk of real dialectics and Marxism. That you have the separation between thought and action, theory and practice, all of these kind of dichotomies of which we've been accustomed to since the old mind-body dualism of René Descartes and the beginning of the world of calculated rationality. Right? So, and he says the end product, whether he likes it or not, is a Kantian philosophy of history. So I know I use her every week. Miss Ocasio is thinking about ultimately perpetual peace and bourgeois reconciliation with the workers, right? This is a reconciled politics. Lukacs has none of this in mind. This is not a Hegelian reconciliation that ultimately,
He's talking about antagonism.
Yes, it's about antagonisms, absolutely. So this is, again, he's in the thick of this, right? And that try to figure the movie this way. So the Russian Revolution happens. Lenin's put together all these nice philosophical notebooks, volume 38, right, on Lenin. On Hegel, right, the philosophical Hegel that go through Hegel. Lukacs comes along, highly educated German, Dilthey, Zimmel being his teachers, as well as very well immersed in Kant and in Hegel. And he's thinking this through, as an emergent communist, right? And, at the same time, you're getting the party dogma out of Moscow, right? That is following Lenin to a degree, but also vulgarizing Lenin, right? So there's this mechanical Marxism at work. The economic and philosophical manuscripts, the Paris manuscripts, are not found until 1932. So what's been taken out of Marx is any kind of notion of the laborer, him or herself, right? It's become just capital is the antagonism. If you go back and you read Soviet, documents of that period, you see there's not that movement of alienation, objectivity really happening. So he's responding to this both historically during this period. And you see the concept of the totality at work also in the theory of the novel in terms of the epic form, right? He's really talking about integrated civilizations. And he bemoans this. He's a in some ways, Lukacs, part of the problem is a very romantic anti-capitalist. It's a German romantic anti-capitalism that comes through. That's highly, highly intelligent. You know, I mean, you know, he wrote a piece called Goethe and His Age. You know, he wrote, you know, all the labor ontologies are all about Romanticism up to Marx. And Marx is a kind of product, if you will, of the French Enlightenment, German Romanticism, English political economy, and, you know, French socialism, you know, at least in the beginning of the equation, right? So, so anyway, I'm just saying, to me, he's someone I think we at least from my point of view, is worth, you know, reading and rethinking. Whether or not it has relations to where we are exactly today. Is a Bernard Stiegler more important? Alain Badiou, you know, is a kind of Heideggerian Marxism more powerful? Maybe, right? In terms of where we are. But he is an expert dialectician. You really see a mind at work. I mean, this is the reason to assign it, that he's, you know, really trying to grasp real relations. And this is really where he's going. So why I bring this up, you know, in terms of our, and your lived experience is telling you, right, that this is not a new, you know, a new thing since Marx. That's probably true, yeah, in a way. And I think he would admit it too himself. You know, he's just reworking, you know, from philosophy, you know. I mean, the thing about Marx and the relation, we'll go over this with Adorno, it's a good segue in some senses to Adorno's essay, Why Still Philosophy, is that Marx himself, you know, even though trained in philosophy, never wrote quote-unquote philosophical treatises, and the tradition always was saying Marx announced the death of philosophy, but it continued to live on, right? And, you know, this is someone that dies in his chair, as I told you, with Aristotle's, logic at his, on his armchair in ancient Greek, that is, not in German. So, yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that what I read a book years ago? I don't know if I understood it. The poverty of philosophy.
That's on Proudhon.
Oh, that's on him.
Yeah, that's in the
He's-
movie, by the way. It's a nice,
Yeah,
nice
yeah. He's
part of the movie
he's
of
satirizing.
in the Raoul Peck. Have all of you seen the movie's worth seeing?
Oh, yeah. I
It's
could
on
see it.
Netflix. You can get it.
Oh, yeah?
I mean, it's worth the German actor August Biel, who plays Marx, is quite good
really
in the
good,
role.
yeah.
He's very good in the role. Yeah. And yeah,
And Jenny.
she never looked so beautiful. Huh?
Yeah. According to photos, I think she was.
She was, yeah. She was the Westphalen. You know, he liked that.
Was
You
a
know,
daughter of
married
a
a
baron, right?
Jewish converted Jew son, right? He says in the movie. Yeah.
He was.
Father was a baron.
Yeah, just in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, the social democrat reconciling
Yeah.
stuff, there was a really good op-ed piece in yesterday's Times, I think it was, which was really more of an obituary in a sense, by this, about this 103-year-old, he died at 103 just last week, a guy named Levitas, who
Uh-huh.
grew up in London's East End, or he migrated there as a refugee when it was almost entirely Jewish, apparently,
Right.
around the turn of the century. And he battled, you know, he went to work in the textiles and everything at 12 years old, whatever. Became a young communist, member of the Young Communist League, battled the fascists, you know, including Mosley's attempts to invade the East End in
Right.
36. Was a lifelong communist, and the article says communist, lifelong communist. The heading is lifelong socialist. Dies.
There's a big difference.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
To me, the difference I just wrote up, the socialist
Yeah.
believes that there's reconciliation at the end, and that the idea
Yeah.
is being reconciled of, you
That's
know,
right.
a quote equal society
Yeah.
and all these kind of matters.
Yeah.
Whereas for the communist, antagonisms will continue, and that unless you're immersed in that antagonistic dialectic and you understand it as part of the internal movement of history as well as the external, you know, that you're always fighting multiple enemies, both within and without. I mean, we're all fighting, you know, capital in its latest incarnations, but at the same time, there's always these tendencies within that distort, reify, in some way, consciousness, that go away from the class consciousness of the proletariat. And that's another thing he's really trying to do. If anyone's on the side of the, quote, worker in history, or the proletariat, is Lukacs. You know, this is really what he considers the worker, the exterminating angel. This is the agency of history. It's a big question for us today. You know, we're going to raise this question at the Left Forum. You know, I'm going to do a group. I mean, at least me and some people. You know, is there an alternative? Question mark. You know, and whether or not where is the new agency in all of this? Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking of writing a letter to the Times, which I know won't get published about.
That's okay. Write it anyway. We'll
Yeah.
publish it on
Yeah.
our
Yeah, we can put it
website.
on
Yeah.
the-
Unpublished
Perfect.
letters from the New York Times.
Yeah.
What did you say? What's
Well-
in your letter?
Well, first of all,
Fuck
I was thinking maybe they changed it to socialist because it's shorter, but actually they have the identical number of letters as communist.
Yeah. They still ask.
Write the letter.
They still ask when you apply for permanent residency if you're a communist or ever have been.
They still ask
They
that.
still
ask
ask
that
that. It's
when-
against the law.
No,
No, no,
they
no,
ask
no,
you.
no. They still
No?
ask.
Yeah, they ask
And they
you.
ask you
Against
in the
the law.
interview, like when you
That's
go for
been
the
overturned
interview,
by
they
the courts.
nope. When you
Well,
go to the interview,
ask
they
how
ask
recently?
you.
Well, do they ask, have you been a
Wait
member
till
of
you
the
get tape recordings
party?
of this so we can
Or
file
do
a
they
big
ask-
lawsuit.
I
on
should be
behalf of the
careful.
Fifth
I've been waiting on a
International.
new one.
No, but do they ask, are you, or have you ever been a member of the party, or do they ask if you're a communist?
I don't remember.
Both.
Away from the stand.
Both.
Well, you have to answer
Very,
like
very-
Stanley.
Yeah, I mean, they're both.
Communist? No, they're much too conservative.
I'll find the paperwork for you.
They asked.
They asked. You were
I had
there.
to sign it too.
You didn't have to sign
Much too
that. As an
conservative
American,
for me.
you were allowed to be.
Parties?
Yeah.
No, I haven't found
But-
one that I haven't gone to.
I don't like food.
They still
No, but
ask. I
mean,
couldn't
you know,
believe
The
it.
difference could be a death sentence in many countries, you know.
Well, that's true, but not here, not now.
Well,
It used to
except
be.
for
yeah,
the ranting
slow
about
No
suicide.
other Western
The ranting
democracy.
about cultural Marxism, though,
right.
is getting very deadly.
Right. Okay, but let me just go down here. So, the structure of bourgeois society, number 11, on page 11 at the bottom of the page, just to go on a little bit about this social democracy. So this is going to be coming up. You're going to hear more and more of all these people that are, you know, DSA, you know, et cetera, and, you know, in the political sphere, you're going to hear this word socialism out there, social democrat, more and more on dominant media, not only in our circles, right? Okay, so anyway, the structure of bourgeois society is established as the universal form of society in general. For the central problem that Adler attacks of the real dialectics, or better, antagonism, is nothing but one of the typical ideological forms of the capitalist order. But whether capitalism is rendered immortal on economic or ideological grounds, whether with naive nonchalance or with critical refinement, is of little importance. Because he's not about the overthrow of the system. No, they're about a reconciliation, a compromise, etc. This is really what it's ultimately about. Social democracy, to me, means basically market-based socialism. It's about market economy and a combination of, quote, delivering the goods to more people with a rhetoric of equality. That's all ultimately it is, in some ways. Right? It's not about the overthrow of reified relations. It's not about the overthrow of the system. You know, it's not about casting, you know, our lot with trying to create an alternative, whether or not we have one or not. I'm not so sure. I mean, we have to think this through, you know, going forward. You know, yeah. What will the transition be like? What is the good life in the future? What does that really mean? You know, obviously we don't have it, and obviously they're not offering it. So yeah.
Yeah, and social democracy doesn't establish any lasting institutions, so that when the economic times go bad again,
Right.
you know,
That's
and
another thing.
capitalism reasserts
Good point.
itself.
Absolutely.
nakedly, they'll
Well,
just-
we've seen this time and
they're
time
being
again.
blown away in Brazil, everywhere.
Yeah, and look at what happened to Allende's Chile.
Yeah.
Right away, how quick they were to put in the Chicago Boys, the Washington Consensus, how quick that was ready. Yeah,
And that was the
And what they
leading
did.
constitutional democracy in Latin America. was
yes,
Chile.
absolutely.
They
Yeah,
liquidated it, literally.
Yeah,
Didn't
they liquidated it,
it.
yes. Yeah. So anyway, I think this is important, right? And page 13, again, going back to the concept of the totality, the intelligibility of objects, bottom of the page, develops in proportion as we grasp their function in the totality to which they belong. That is why the only dialectical conception of totality can enable us to understand reality as a social process. There's not this reality out there, you know, etc. You know, we should not be saying wow. We should be saying understand more. Right? In some ways, right? For only this conception dissolves the fetishistic forms, both in consciousness, fetishistic choice of objects, fetishistic use of categories. It's a good way to be a critical thinker, is to look at how the categories and concept are formed and what fetish made that happen. The use of statistics, right? All of these kind of things, very, very good to dismantle. This is what, to me, deconstruction and dismantling operations from a Marxist deconstructive perspective is really about. Produced by the capitalist mode of production, and to see them as mere illusions which are not less illusory for being seen to be necessary. These unmediated concepts, these laws, sprout just as inevitably from the soil of capitalism and veil the real relations between objects. Always veil it. They can be seen as ideas necessarily held by the agents of the capitalist system of production, and they're therefore objects of knowledge, but the object which is known through them is not the capitalist system of production, but the ideology of the ruling class. We don't look at Amazon in terms of its system of distribution. We look at it through the ideology of Jeff Bezos getting $1.7 billion. This is a corporation, by the way, that has made a profit, I think, in 1/4 of its history. This is a corporation that is a complete shell game, but it works in this universe of finance capital and the derivatives and the creation of, the banks in collusion, finance capital in collusion with these so-called innovative entrepreneurs, right? Well, what we're going to focus on is how it destroys the neighborhood in Long Island City. We're not going to really grasp all the real relations between it. We're going to bemoan this and say, isn't this terrible what happened? Wasn't Long Island City great beforehand? Never was great. It's an ugly part of the city, to put it mildly, right? Yeah, but this is another way of what Lukacs is talking about, right? That, you can vulgarize, you can mechanicize your thinking dialectically to this kind of point where you're only looking at, image, immediacy, and not really looking at the real relations that created this.
End products instead of
the whole process.
Yeah.
The process, right? Yeah, we always forget the process. Yeah, that's going on. So anyway, when the veil is torn, does historical knowledge become possible? This is Marx, as you said. This is Marx speaking too. We have to take apart everything in order to unveil, to see what's really there, this relation. Heidegger, of course, with the aletheia, the concealment and the unconcealment as an interpretive model of history, even though he's using it in the Greek sense, and it's both dialectical and non-dialectical in a sense. But anyway, for the function of these unmediated concepts that have been derived, so these unmediated concepts are derived, again, just lived experience from the fetishistic forms of objectivities make the phenomena of capitalist society appear as supra-historical essences. The system will last eternally. Yeah, it's supra-historical. Right? The knowledge of the real, objective nature of a phenomena, the knowledge of its historical character, and the knowledge of its actual function in the totality of society form, therefore, a single, undivided act of cognition. The unity is shattered by the pseudo-scientific method. Thus, only through the dialectic method could the distinction, and he goes into Marx here, between constant, right, and variable capital, crucial to economics, be understood. So he goes right away to capital to show this totality at work in Capital Volume 1, the distinction that's made between constant and variable capital. And if you went to talk to Jeff Bezos about that, he would say, I only know capital. He doesn't know the difference between constants and variable capital. He doesn't know the formula, right, of surplus value. He doesn't know any of this stuff. However, the question is, this is the ruling class ideology that's going to tell you that they're commanding, they're the masters of the universe, et cetera, completely divorced from real relations in terms of society. But this is the product we become in capital. Yeah? Real relations are not there. This is why there's such insanity. If you really think about this, the system is so irrational in its base, at this point, through all its rational mechanizations and the effects that it's had, that it has really driven everybody to the point, the brink of a kind of insanity, right?
Collective
Yeah,
psychosis.
yeah, collective psychosis, right?
That's what
That
I'm-
we're unable to really take action. We get stuck in this practical inert. You know, we think that a good action is a demonstration in Long Island City, or, you know, a bazaar on Saturday afternoon selling scarves with, machine guns on them. But anyway, you know, this is a problem.
downstairs.
This is a problem downstairs. I bought one. I'm stupid enough to take one. You bought one too? Good. I'm glad we're on the same page. We're help support with our excess cash. I can call it that these days. Anyway, so, I mean, look, again, the point here is to try to think through things through this concept of totality. We're going to go back to this with Althusser. I mentioned this in the writing, because Althusser will criticize Lukacs, and we'll go there later, on having just an expressive totality vis-a-vis Hegel, and he doesn't really engage with a structural totality. So we're going to talk about this, how this works out in base and superstructure. But since we haven't read him, we have to, we'll just keep that, on the, the future purview, right? So, all right. So, why classical economics failed? This section's very good. This 5 pages on the concept of the totality. If you want a good, elementary, and a very concentrated view of Lukacs's, contribution to Hegelian-Marxist dialectics, pages 10 through 15 in this book, is a very nice condensed version. Okay, going back to what, you mentioned, yes, he goes through the antipathies of bourgeois thought in the second part, so to be fair to Lukacs, and my mistake for not reading the whole thing, for about 40 pages, and Antipodes, there's a proof on both sides, right? And this is Kant's, great contribution in the critique of pure reason that drives most people crazy, when you start thinking, that everything has a fact and a counterfactual, and, everything can be in this antinomic relation. So, anyway, this is the next section, and then finally he goes through the knowledge of the proletariat in the final section, which is the class consciousness. How does one come to class consciousness, right? And most of this is about Kant, and he goes into becoming. And let me just say this, page 197, if you have it, since this has been about the phenomenon of reification. We didn't read this, but this is the section. Reification is therefore, this is page 197, the necessary immediate reality of every person living in capitalist society. Okay? Reification, I repeat, is then the necessary immediate reality of every person living in capitalist society. This is section 6 of the last section, page 197. It can be overcome only by constant and constantly renewed efforts to disrupt the reified structure of existence by concrete and relating to the concrete manifested contradictions of the total development. This is crucial. By becoming conscious of the immanent meanings of these contradictions for the total development. But it must be emphasized the structure can only be disrupted only if the immanent contradictions of the process are made conscious. Only when the consciousness of the proletariat is able to point out the road along which the dialectic of history is objectively impelled, but which it cannot travel unaided with the consciousness of the proletariat, will the consciousness of the proletariat awaken to the consciousness of the process, and only then will the proletariat become the identical subject-object of history whose praxis will change reality. Okay? This is Lukacs in, basic form speaking, right? Right here. If the proletariat fails to take this step, the contradiction will remain unresolved. We've seen nothing, this is the history of the unions right here, in one sentence, and will be reproduced by the dialectical mechanics of history at a higher level in an altered form and with increased intensity. As Stanley has pointed out, and I think very rightfully so, the end of unions was 1934-5 with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. Yeah, this was the death of the unions, right there. I mean, there have been, some movement since then, but it is the death of the unions with the passage of the NLRB.
Why do you say that? I don't know.
Okay, well, because it created collective bargaining which favored management
Collective begging.
and begging, yes. Yes. Collective begging.
That was the hidden
Stanley.
agenda.
Yeah. Collective begging, yeah. No bargaining, really, just begging. And I've been through this at LIU, and I know what the begging's really about. I mean, after that debacle there, after a lockout, of which then faculty actually gives up the right to strike and signs a contract just as bad or worse over which they voted against 9 months earlier, almost unanimously. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of mechanisms are in place in these people's psyche to produce this kind of willing slavery to the system? Yeah, I mean, it's still, disgusts me. I'm not rattled, but I'm disgusted. Yeah, anyway.
I think
Yeah.
unionization never exceeded 33%. I read that somewhere.
Yeah, maybe
At the
that was the
highest.
highest, yeah.
At the
Yeah,
highest.
but I mean, I don't think Lukacs is advocating for trade unionism or unionism in general. He's advocating for revolution here. I'm just making a reference to, what he's saying here in our own history, that unless you understand the contradictions, if you fail to take the step into the contradictions remain unresolved, right? And that, they'll be reproduced, in the system with greater intensity. So now the bosses have had the upper hand, since Reagan, and before,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
And if you go back to 35, it's already on the books. I don't know if you've ever been before the NLRB, but it's a rubber stamping organization for the government. I mean, for the, the bosses, right? Very, seldom that they vote and rule in favor of the labor, in favor of labor. So anyway, 2, the relation to totality does not need to become explicit. The plenitude of totality is not to be consciously integrated into the motives and the actions of objects of action. What is crucial is that there should be an aspiration towards totality. And this is important again for Lukács, the aspiration towards understanding all the real relations that make up something, and that action should serve the purpose described above in the totality of the process. Yeah, with the mounting capitalist socialization of society, and we can go back to, Gramsci, that great phrase of Gramsci, the socialization of ideas. How does that take place? How do we get ingrained and brainwashed into the thinking where we are, right? And here it's the capitalist socialization of society. So they're, in some ways on the same page. It becomes increasingly possible and hence necessary to integrate the content of each specific event into a totality of contents. Never say single issues. To me, again, and I wrote about this, Stanley wrote about it in the first issue of Situations, how specific identity politics and single issue politics killed any possibility of radical action.
Get you nowhere.
Killed it. Every time we got to single issue politics, that's my issue, that's the hat I wear, you lost the sense of the totality. You lost the sense of that you're fighting in this battle, this romantic anti-capitalism, I think. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
that's a defining characteristic of what we are, American capitalism.
Yes, of course. Well, we're the melting pot. We're all in the same pot, and we melt the same way, right? right. Anyway, yeah. All right. Of course, anyway, world economics, et cetera. Anyway, number 3, judging whether an action is right or wrong is essential to relate it to its function in the total process. How do you make these judgments about whether what action's being taken is efficient or right in the context? It always has to be related to the whole. Always, for Lukács, right? The proof of the pudding is in the eating. Engels said this, right? He probably learned that in that district he went to. I'm just kidding, right?
In the slums.
Because they serve pudding instead of Angus steak. Yeah, I'm not, Anyway, all right. So this was Brecht's favorite. I love this for saying. The proof is always in the pudding. The question whether human thinking can pretend to objective truth is not a theoretical, but a practical question. Very, very good. Man must prove the truth, the reality and power, the this-sidedness, and that's Hegelian, the thisness of the phenomena of his thinking and practice. So anyway, this section, section 6 is a very good, section 6 of the third part of reification and class consciousness of the proletariat is an excellent description of reification and definition, and I think a very original contribution to this. Yeah. But your point's very well taken to go back around about, what Lukacs is essentially doing is saying nothing radically new than what Marx said in 1844 in Paris, right? Except it's articulated through new philosophical categories, and Marx never used the term that I know of reification in German. He used objectification and alienation, externalization, but he never used reification. So, and if you talk to, if you talk to, I don't know about, I worked construction for, a summer, I worked in the oil rigs in Louisiana. You talk to people, they live in this kind of they make good money, they're strong, they know that the bosses are the bosses, but in a sense, they don't really think it through in terms of the totality of processes. You get this, at least in the manual, trades, right, etc. Yeah. All the people I worked with had the names of the states, Arkansas, Kansas. It was funny, they took up these names of states. They would work on the oil rigs outside Louisiana. You'd go 7 days on the rig, you would work, and then you would take 2 to 10 days off. Then you go back 10 days with 7 days off. And this was a great summer job because it paid, the oil companies pay big money for this kind of stuff. So if you're 15 years old and you need a good summer job and you want to accumulate some cash, you go out there and, so but you can see this consciousness at work. They understand the boss, right? But they don't understand the totality of the process. They understand, what the difference between refined oil and which they're getting out of the Gulf of Mexico, but they don't really, see this as part of a larger whole. So this is where he's coming from too. It is top to bottom, but he's presupposing that the bottom, as subject-object, will rise up. This is what he's presupposing, that you'll have this relationship. And of course, this is I don't know if transformed, it kind of morphs, if you will, a little bit into the proletariat, right, in some ways, in the Soviet Union and other places, right? Yeah. And a working class hero is something to be, right? I won't go through the next lines because that was part of the problem. Right. So anyway, this section is very good, and the ending of it, if you want to kind of come full circle without having to read the 100 and something pages and struggling with it, because this is not easy reading, no question about it. I can say that too. Okay, with the ideology. By the way, I'm going to repeat this.
Where are you now?
Page 197, a little bit above section 6. With the ideology of social democracy, and this is something you can put on when you read your Facebook pages about social democracy, that the proletariat falls victim to the antinomies of reification that we have hitherto analyzed in such detail. The important role increasingly played in this ideology by man as a value, as an ideal, as an imperative, accompanied, of course, by a growing insight into the necessity and logic of the economic process, is only one symptom of this relapse into the reified immediacy of the bourgeoisie. For the unmediated juxtaposition of natural laws and imperatives is the logical expression of immediate societal existence in bourgeois society. I think it's a very good summation of what social democracy does, right? Ultimately. Yep. Anyway, it always looks fatalistically at the laws of capital up here as well. So you can see this, the development, page 196 forward on social democracy. Since this is a topic today. This is a topic I thought we were done with as early as when I was growing up, 1971, 72. Passé. But it's come back with a vengeance, return to the repressed, without the same kind of force either. At least you could argue with those people. Today, it's like, they don't really even know how to define terms, much less, go forward. Okay, so any other thoughts about this? I wanted to also just mention the sense on specialization, which will lead us into the Adorno. This is in the actual reading, The Phenomena of Reification, section 3, where he talks about the over-specialization and how this happens in the division of labor.
What page are you on?
103. And this is section 3 of the Phenomena of Reification, the first part of the long essay. The specialization of skills leads to the destruction of every image of the whole. And as, despite this, the need to grasp, again, the whole, and he keeps repeating this throughout this text, at least cognitively, cannot die out, we find that science, which is likewise based on specialization and thus caught up in the same immediacy, is criticized for having torn the real world into shreds and having lost its vision of the whole. It's very interesting. And this is Heidegger speaking too. This is before Heidegger, right, in a way. Heidegger does this differently in foundational ontology and fundamental ontology when he critiques the sciences. Yeah, please.
I like the term, the macro dimension of what's going on. That's kind of
I didn't know you had such bourgeois economic terms.
I mean, I don't know where, I just took macro and dimension and put them together. And I think
sounds like Paul Samuelson.
It's saying it's analogous or what? It's the same thing.
No, I understand what you're saying. From the micro, micrologies was invented in France. The expert of micrologies was Georges Canquillon, the great medical doctor, philosopher who wrote a book called The Normal and the Pathological, and Ideology and the Rationality of Science. Very beautiful work he did.
What's his name?
Canquillon. Yeah. And anyway, he invented the kind of notion of micrology, right? The micrology. So the micro-macro plays out very actively in bourgeois economics. That's why I was, kind of thinking that way. But I hear what you're saying, the macro-dimensional. I mean, why not just say multi-dimensional, that we stay in this one-dimensionality without the totality? This is something that Marcuse speaks about, one-dimensional man in 64. Lukacs in 23 is speaking to this as well. What he's really doing is talking about how the scientific project, basically is so over-specialized that it doesn't allow for any relation to the whole. So we have this. I mean, Beth knows this very well in terms of the medical, fields and the medical professions, how much the division of labor, what has happened, what's occurred, you need a specialist for this, you got a little thing on your toe, you need a specialist for this. It's not connected to the little thing on your finger, you got to go to another specialist for the bump on the neck, small of the back, et cetera, et cetera.
Or you have foot spurs like Trump.
He has foot spurs? Yeah? Oh, okay.
That's
Yeah, I don't follow him that actively.
That's why he was exempt from service.
Oh, yeah, I see. Oh, yeah, I understand. Okay.
Spurs.
Yeah.
No, he's crippled inside.
Yeah. That's
Who
right.
knows what he had or what he did.
So anyway, he's really here in this section, and one of the reasons, again, I emphasize this, is he's critiquing science from the perspective of the totality again, right? And he has a whole section here on this. And then and about how over-specialization comes into being, right, through the division of labor. And let me just read another thing, we'll go on to Adorno, and, we can always come back around, it's gonna be here. Okay, on page 109, towards the end of this section, and this is about the role of philosophy and the constitution of the discipline, the manner in which this transcendence, right, and the transcendence in terms of the law, and he's speaking about eternal values before that, right, is conceived, shows how vain was the hope for a comprehensive discipline like philosophy might yet still achieve that overall knowledge which the particular sciences have so conspicuously conspicuously renounced by turning away from the material substratum of their conceptual apparatus. There are very, very few philosophers who speak this way. That philosophers' conceptual, framework and the formation of categories and concepts are related to the material substratum of their, of the conceptual frameworks, right? The synthesis would only be possible if philosophy were able to change its approach radically and concentrate on the concrete material totality of what can and should be known. Only then would it be able to break through the barriers erected by a formalism, and this is Kant, this is somewhat of Hegel, this is certainly the neo-Kantian movement he's going after, this kind of new formalism in philosophy, degenerated into a state of complete fragmentation. Nothing to do with societal relations or really in terms of real problems of concrete existence, how divorced this was. And this is one of the reasons that a Heidegger, becomes so prevalent in the 1920s. He's trying to put philosophy back into the concrete. Whether it's the right concrete is another story, but, Dasein and Dasein analysis, but he begins again with the everyday. Philosophy had forgotten this completely, right? So anyway, but this would presuppose an awareness of the causes, the genesis, and the necessity of this formalism. What produced this in history, right? Moreover, it would not be enough to unite the special sciences mechanically. They would have to be transformed inwardly by an inwardly synthesizing philosophical method. It is evident that the philosophy of bourgeois society is incapable of this, right? Not that the desire for synthesis is absent, nor can it be maintained that the best people have welcomed with open arms a mechanical existence hostile to life, and a scientific formalism alien to it. This is very true, because most people live in this kind of universe, in a mechanical existence that is hostile to life, right? Remember Gramsci when he talks about spontaneous philosophy and the mechanical, external environment that produces fragmentation, empty time, episodic character of experience, etc. Okay? But a radical change in outlook is not feasible on the soil of bourgeois society. Again, it's impossible to do business with these people. In all honesty, this is what he's saying. This is how radical Lukacs is. You need a severance from this kind of thinking completely, in order to think it through. Philosophy can attempt to assemble the whole of knowledge encyclopedically, Wilhelm Wundt, one of the founders of modern psychology, or it may radically question the value of formal knowledge for a living life. See the irrationalist philosophies from from Hamann, the mystic, to Henri Bergson. Right? But these episodic trends lie to one side of the main philosophical tradition. The latter acknowledges as given and necessary the results and the achievements of the special sciences and assigns to philosophy the task of exhibiting and justifying the grounds for regarding as valid the concepts so constructed. Philosophy is a handmaiden to the special sciences. He's bemoaning this and saying we don't have, should be the other way around. Right? Thus, philosophy stands in the same relation to the special sciences as they do with respect to empirical reality. The formalistic conceptualization of the special sciences become for philosophy an immutably given substratum, and this signals the final and despairing renunciation of every attempt to cast light on the reification that lies at the root of this formalism. So the reification is also going on in education, right? Strongly in education, in the construction of the special sciences, the particular sciences, the construction of the disciplines,
right?
The conflict of the faculties. I'm sorry?
Althusser.
Yes, right. The reified world henceforth appears definitively and in philosophy under the spotlight of criticism, and is potentiated still further as the only possible world, the only conceptually accessible, comprehensive world vouchsafes to us humans. Whether this gives rise to ecstasy, resignation, or despair, whether we search for a path leading to life via a rational mystical experience, this will do nothing to modify the situation as it is in fact. Right? By confining itself to the study of the possible conditions of the validity of the forms of which its underlying existence is manifested, modern bourgeois thought bars, it's like a barred signifier in the psychoanalytic sense, to a clear view of the problems bearing on the birth and the death of these forms, and on their real essence and substratum. Its finds itself increasingly in the situation of that legendary critic in India who was confronted with the ancient story according to which the world rests upon an elephant. He unleashed the critical question, upon which does the elephant rest? On receiving the answer that the elephant stands on a tortoise, criticism declared itself satisfied. This is bourgeois mentality. You can see this in the comic books, in all the, form, anyway. It is obvious that even if he had continued to press apparently critical questions, he could only elicit a third miraculous animal. He would not have been able to discover the solution. So anyway, he ends the section with this notion of philosophy, and bourgeois thought. There's no such thing as philosophy in the Marxist sense, right? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Heidegger does this, he has a nice illusion that's similar. He talks about breaking the chalk. And every time you break the chalk, you think you're going to get to the essence of the chalk, but you break it again, and until you just have a pile of dust.
Right.
But it's kind of the same.
It's a good notion of history in some senses, huh? You keep breaking it open in the continuum, and you're going to see ultimately the ashes, huh? Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts or questions before we move on to the Adorno? Why philosophy still?
Does he ever?
Sure.
I'm not able to
No problem.
read, but does he ever talk about the absolute necessity of a vanguard party of intellectuals, because the working masses? I said this once before, and to offend you, I
don't offend me. It's okay.
The
I can be
working
offended.
masses are, for the most part, functional illiterates.
Yeah.
They are literate.
Yeah, I mean, Lukacs is a Leninist in this context, that he believes in the party as vanguard, and the party is composed of intellectuals.
It's a necessity.
Yes.
Given the
Gramsci feels the same way. I mean, Gramsci understands this because he has the notion of the organic intellectual.
Yeah.
When you put the word intellectual next to organicity, you're talking about someone who is emerging with, or coming up with the emerging class. And, in Gramsci's sense, the opposition is organic versus traditional. In Lukacs, it's radical versus, bourgeois thought, a revolutionary versus bourgeois thought. Gramsci doesn't use the word bourgeois so much, he's, So it's interesting because again, to go back to this course, what is a Marxist philosophy, where would we go, etc. How does one, try to accomplish this? So I don't think we have one yet. I mean, in a way, a full-fledged Marxist philosophy. That you have to think of this in terms of traditional theory versus critical theory. You have to think of this in terms of the organic versus the traditional intellectual. The traditional intellectual will also speak 9 languages, but he will mimic the status quo. He's faced with the barriers of any kind of movement. In Lukacs' sense, remember, he's writing this 1923, it's 6 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, 3.5 years after he's thrown out of Hungary, right, by the reactionary forces, and he's writing this in the heat of the moment, right, in between Lenin's still alive, when he writes this, and he's writing this in order to mobilize, right, a vanguard intelligentsia, to think through these things against the mechanical, vulgar Marxist approaches to philosophical thinking, and how can this be transmitted, right? So this is another, please,
I think we read somewhere the phrase the organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie. Is that a contradiction in terms? Or?
No.
Who said the organic intellectual of the bourgeoisie?
I did.
Oh, you did?
No.
Oh, I mean, I'm just wondering if these writers were reading.
No, there
I'm
was-
sorry, no.
No, there was somebody,
I'm sorry.
That's a
and maybe it was a
contradiction.
talk show, maybe it was George Will, I don't know. But,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Is that a contradiction?
Well, I mean,
in
that,
terms to
I'm
have-
sure Jordan Peterson and this
Yeah.
other guys, these other people, Spencer, and all these people who use those terms to, you
The
know, kind of
alt-right
confuse
has-
people.
The alt-right has enthusiastically picked up Gramsci.
Yeah.
Oh,
They
good.
want their
Maybe.
own
Yeah.
and organic intellectuals,
I see.
Right.
as opposed to Adorno, etc., which they refer to as cultural Marxism,
yeah, well,
I see.
it means-
which is a kind of anti-Semitic
Yeah,
phrase for them.
that's right, it is anti-Semitic.
And
It's a euphemism for, yeah.
Because they do use the same language to talk about
Yeah, I-
bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I mean, but, you know,
Use the term.
Gramsci never used organic intellectual as bourgeois.
Mhm, yeah.
There's no such thing in him.
Yeah, right.
Revolutionary intellectual in Lukacs. In fact, Lukacs, you know, Godard had a great saying once: in order to become a revolutionary intellectual, one must give up being an intellectual. This is a very profound statement. How do you give up all that training? How do you decode all of that what made you an intellectual? And how can you see it from, you know, afar? You know, how do you study form of bourgeois thought? How do you begin to see it? You know? Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, you know,
no,
throwing
I think
that out
Part
there.
of it
You
is the-
invent
is the
new
old-
concepts.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And you divide reality in a new way, which makes me think it's somewhat epistemological.
Right. Right.
Well, it's also, I think the alt-right is trying to get more sophisticated and pushing to the fore more, thoughtful, reflective, providing a veneer over the thugs, and basically by putting forward people who could give interviews and be accepted. And I think maybe it comes from that there's some,
Yeah.
some attempt to present themselves
Right.
as the.
How you use
Right.
terms when you use the.
Well, I mean, we really need a study. I mean, you know, we never really got a great study of the far right. I mean, there were a couple that did it, you know, then the Tea Party and all this, the religious right. We've had some studies, but this new phenomena of, quote, pseudo-intellectual alt-right led by Steve Bannon, Richard Spencer, Jordan, I mean, these
Richard
kind of
Spencer
figures.
wears suits,
He does, okay.
important part.
I'm glad to hear that. Like,
Well, he's
like
a
John
bespoke
Coltrane, thin
gentleman.
ties? No, I'm
He's
just-
bespoke.
Yeah.
Needs his wife.
Yeah. Well, anyway, all to say, I mean, I think this demands a real study, but to use those kind of terms are obviously contradictions.
Right.
And then, of course, the historical obligation of any kind of revolutionary practice is to correct this, to do so both in writing and whenever you can. I mean, you know, in a way, because it doesn't mean that. It's just why, you know, this whole thing of democratic socialists, they don't really know what socialism is. They don't have a history of socialism. It's really bad in a sense that they use this kind of vocabulary where the alt-right can take this up very easily. Now, if they had an elaborate notion of what the transition to socialism means and historically what it meant in terms of the taking of the means of production, have you ever heard this come out of any person's mouth in the electoral politics? That I'm a socialist and I'm about taking over the means of production?
Unless
We're
they
about
talk- yeah.
socializing, you know, the means of production? I mean, you know, for the social benefit of all? You know?
Yeah, unless they
You know.
talk about cooperatives or.
No, this is nonsense. This is
I know, but
substandard.
that's
Yeah,
as close
yeah,
as they
yeah,
get,
yeah,
to.
Yeah. So this is a problem we're facing. We have both an internal, like Lukacs had the mechanical Marxists, we have in some senses this kind of use of vocabulary that's empty. It's an empty vocabulary. That's part of the problem. It's just pure rhetoric. It's not even good rhetoric. At least Aristotle, when he wrote the rhetoric, had understandings of when you use rhetoric in certain contexts and how to use it. Cicero, the same thing, when these treatises on rhetoric. Or Nietzsche, or, you know, read Paul de Man, despite his affiliations, the rhetoric of Romanticism. You know, you begin to understand, you know, this kind of different, you know.
Taking
yeah,
over
it's-
the
yeah.
means of production, I mean, the means of production, by and large, today has been outsourced. So it means taking over other countries.
I like that.
What do we
Great
make in
extent.
here in
that's
this
true.
country? So you want to take over
We make
Thailand?
consumers.
Well, we make great Boeing airplanes. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
been a joke.
Well, that's kind of, you're defining economic imperialism. I mean, that's
Right.
finance capital, global finance capital. We kind of have. When you look at the East Asia crisis and all that hot money flowing in, when we figured out they could make stuff.
We're one market under God with consumers instead of citizens. That's a little
That's true.
formula. I mean, it
think
may
the-
sound cute,
The
but
key is
it's
taking
true.
over the distribution. That's what Bezos has done. He hasn't taken over any means
Well,
of
that's a
production.
completely under-theorized thing in all of Marxian political economy has been the mode of distribution. Mode of production, over-theorized in some ways. Consumption, over-theorized. I mean, good stuff all the time. But no one has really taken on the modes of distribution in this kind of notion. You know, you see this in some ways, a book like Andreas Malm's book on the climate, you know, fossil capitalism. He's going to look at a shift in terms of distribution because of the steam engine and because of these kind of moments. And you see it occasionally. You certainly see it in Marx and the Grundrisse, you know, because that's part of the totality, you know, the four elements to the totality: production, consumption, distribution, and exchange. You know, and you have to think that way, but distribution has always been the most under-theorized. And this is what Bezos figured out.
Yeah.
This is what Google's figured out. How do you distribute semantic fields? Through algorithms, right?
Or
look
Uber.
at what we got. Uber, another one, right? So this is something that we were really not done. You bring up a great point. Yeah, yeah. What about the mode of distribution? Yeah, in the totality. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So maybe that's where the fight is right now. Yeah.
How would you theorize that? How would you strategize a fight on that terrain?
Well, I mean, I think you have to begin with fictitious capital to start about that. How does this occur? How is it that
The
a company can
financialization
go
of
to
the economy.
how can a company go to Goldman Sachs or the banks and say, this is all we're going to do? We're just middlemen in space, right? Such as an Amazon. How much money can you give us? How much money can you keep feeding us? So you'd have to begin there with some kind of relation
Except
to
a
the new
warehouse is
fictitious.
not immaterial. A
No, I
warehouse
know
is
that.
real.
No, I know. Yeah.
So, yeah.
So if you
the-
could jam their
someone-
site.
The Chinese worker produces the
Yes.
stuff, then it's gotta get
But
to
he
the
can,
warehouse where?
he can jettison though those modes of distribution almost anywhere at this point.
If you
This
go
is
to
a-
Amazon's site, you know, you type in Amazon, and instead of seeing the you know, search buttons and all of these things, you just see a fist.
Mr. Hulot did not take a holiday, huh? Right.
You can't order anything
Right, right.
except the revolution, which is
Right.
not
Well, the Google
televised.
workers went
We
out.
don't- we're not
I
the
mean,
order of
and Amazon workers have protested their association with ICE face recognition.
Yeah.
And when, I mean, tools down for Google digital workers is kind of powerful. Tools down means everything.
No, it's a military machine. You have to think of it that way too. What they've created is a kind of new form of militarism, you know, in
No, I
terms of
just
how
mean
they
in the-
eat
in the
together, how they do.
opposition to it.
But I'm
If
talking
the-
about how they work together too. It's
Yeah.
a new form of a kind of military operation, right, in many ways. You know, I went to the Google, I did Rick Wolf's up, he does the YouTube at Google on the 6th floor there. And I went upstairs, right? And all the employees there, they're all sitting at one big nice wooden table, right? With state-of-the-art food. You know, they have pizzas being delivered, etc. But they all cooperate and eat together. And you can see all the smiling face. I mean, I know they all hate each other. But anyway, you can see this kind of new culture, cafeteria, work desk, etc., station, etc., going on. Yeah. So it's very much, yeah.
Does
And-
Rick have anything to say about that? That totality? How
No,
it
he
works?
likes the site, you know, it's state of the art. That's the
I
way
didn't
Rick
know
says.
he recorded there.
Yes, he records
that's
at
really
Google.
significant.
Yeah, on the 6th floor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about co-optation, maybe? Much?
There are no worker cooperatives there, believe me. They ordered the same pizza, but
No, I
that's what
mean
I'm just saying.
co-optation.
Yeah, co-optation, of course, yeah,
Ordering
Not
pizza,
co-ops.
distribution.
yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to a Bloomberg thing this morning about distribution and how, you know, the major, Amazon, et cetera, are not making profits because of the free shipping part of it, which actually costs them as much or more than their profits. They're trying, they have a real problem with that.
Well,
Amazon
Bezos
Prime.
is planning on sidestepping the U.S. Post Office and starting his own.
Delivery of their
Yeah,
own.
he's just
Delivery
gonna-
of his own.
He's gonna own it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with drones and things.
It's not so much the free shipping, it's the free returns.
Yeah, it's
Well, why study philosophy? Let's go on to, and Adorno is not begging the question here. He admits so in the beginning. So this is Adorno. I think this was on a radio program in Germany when he went back after the war. I think it's 1956, if I'm not mistaken, that he basically gave this talk. Actually, 1962, my apologies, a radio lecture, and it was published in 62 by Verlag, and then of course translated into the critical models, and it's 13 pages, right? And I'm going to try to highlight some things, so that we can at least get into it a little bit. So typical Adorno to such a question, and as to why still philosophy, for the formulation to which I myself am responsible, although its dilettantish tone does not escape it, most people will already guess the answer. So here's Adorno at work in terms of begging the question, right? Okay, so all that notwithstanding, he concludes this paragraph, I have some right to raise the question for the simple reason that I'm not sure of the answer. So this is Adorno at work in terms of the paragraph, right? The first paragraph, and I'm not really begging the question here. Okay, so he basically is taking away philosophy's role as self-mastery. He must know that philosophy is no longer applicable to techniques of mastering one's life, techniques in both the literal and figurative sense with which philosophy was always so closely entwined, and philosophy no longer offers a medium of self-cultivation. So Peace, Michel Foucault, who basically talked of philosophy as mastery of the self in the years of the 80s, right? 20-something years after this, right? So there is this return to what Adorno is basically saying is over in 62. Yeah.
Which is not even gone when he's saying it either.
No, of course not. I mean, the antagonists here are obviously Heidegger and the existential tradition in France. Sartre and Camus in particular. Yep. Right? And remember, he's specific to the German intellectuals, a small class of German community in their collective philosophical language. Now here's Adorno, and let me just say, Adorno's relationship to philosophy was through Krakauer, Siegfried Krakauer, from Caligari to Hitler, one of his most famous books, The Salaried Masses. Krakauer wrote, by the way, those of you interested in Benjamin's concept of history, Krakauer wrote a book on the concept of history while he was at Columbia here in New York. But anyway, Krakauer had the Sunday meetings in which they would study Kant. Very, very important circle for Adorno. So he says, roughly, this is page 6, since the death of Kant, philosophy has made itself suspect because of its disparity with the positive sciences, especially the natural sciences, and it was the first discipline in public awareness to succumb to the crisis of the humanistic concept of culture. The Kantian Hegelian revivals, whose titles alone reveal the feebleness of their programs, right? So for Adorno, philosophy was dead at the time of the Enlightenment, right? That was the last gasp with the Kantian Enlightenment, with the German Aufklärung, right, is dead. Okay? And in the general tendency towards specialization, and this is important, going back to Lukacs, because this happens to philosophy too, philosophy has in the general tendencies towards specialization, philosophy too has established itself as a specialized discipline, one purified of all specific content. In so doing, philosophy has denied its own constitutive concept. This is very important. The intellectual freedom that does not obey the dictates of specialized knowledge. Yeah, this is what philosophy has done. So what you do now in philosophy departments, if you go through any major philosophy department in the United States, you see you've got a specialist in epistemology, you've got a specialist in moral philosophy, you have a specialist in this domain, cognitive processes, right, etc. AI in philosophy. All these over-specialized moments, right, but nobody's a specialist in the history of philosophy. You don't see anybody specializing in concept writing or category formation,
Or ontology.
etc. Very few people in ontology, which is a lacking discipline again. I'm not so sure we need it. We'll talk about that when we get to Negre and Della Volpe. At the same time, by abstaining from definite content, whether it's formal logic or theory of science, or as the legend of being, that's again a swipe at Heidegger, beyond all beings, the being beyond all beings, philosophy declared its bankruptcy regarding concrete societal goals, right? So in a way, he's parodying Marx, the end of philosophy. Philosophy has hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to transform it, right? To be sure, philosophy therefore merely ratified a process largely tantamount to its own history. More and more fields were snatched away from it and transformed into science. It scarcely had any other choice but to become either a science or a minuscule tolerated enclave, which as such already conflicts with what it wants to be, a non-particularized pursuit. Newtonian physics was still called philosophy. Modern scientific consciousness would see in this an archaic relic, a vestige of the earlier epoch of Greek speculation, whose sound explanation of nature and sublime metaphysics were still inseparably interwoven in the name of essence of things. That is why some resolute beings have proclaimed that such archaic themes constitute the only philosophy and try to restore them. Heidegger again. These are all, again, the Heideggerian philosophy, 1962. And 1962, by the way, is Heidegger's piece on time and being, when he actually declares time as being, right? It's no longer being and time. It's time and being. To think time is really our task for the future.
He also writes The End of Philosophy, too.
He writes The End of Philosophy and The Task of Thinking.
Right.
So we're going to go through this when we get to Althusser on the anti-humanism in philosophy, too. But Adorno's participating in this anti-humanism idea. Yeah, very much so. I mean, he doesn't call it as such. I mean, it's really Heidegger and, the letter on humanism. I mean, for those of you that don't know this, I should just do this real quickly. 1947 marks a moment after the war when Heidegger publishes the letter on humanism.
What is the title of this?
Of this part, why still philosophy?
I just want the why.
The letter on humanism,
Yeah.
which is a
It's
response
in
to the commission
critical
piece.
models.
Online,
It's a
right?
commission piece
I
by,
think.
does anyone have tissue? No? Or,
Yes.
yeah, oh, can I get it? Yeah.
It's in
Thank you so
critical
much.
models.
Why so?
Thank you.
Just
Why
take
still
the-
philosophy?
Yeah, I know, but I think
yeah,
I
so-
found it online already.
1947 is a kind of crucial year in the sense that, it's a year before the Truman Doctrine, but anyway, it's also a year and a half into the Greek Civil War and many other things, the slaughter of the Italian communists, the Christian Democrats. But letter on humanism philosophically is a crucial turning point where Heidegger basically responds to Sartre's existentialism as a humanism. And this becomes really crucial to a whole generation of philosophers coming up in France after this, right? And this begins the humanist controversy, which we're going to read from Althusser's point of view as a communist, not from Heidegger's, although I certainly suggest to read this. Joss referred to a later piece where Heidegger says, it's the end of philosophy and the task of thinking. So for our curriculum in the Institute for Radical Imagination, instead of saying we're going to have a domain called philosophy, we're going to have a domain called the history of systems of thinking. We're going to try to broaden that way out, and philosophy will be one of them. You like that, huh? Good, okay, good.
Wasn't that Foucault's
No.
designation?
He
He was
doesn't-
professor of systems of, I think, of the history of the systems of.
Yeah,
I
well,
don't
we're
know.
going to do something like the French, yes, right. It's
Sys-
much more important. so-
Systems of ideas, that's what it was.
Yeah, right. So anyway, so Heidegger writes that as well. So anyway, this actually declares, that philosophy itself is not about the humanistic tradition, and he actually says in the speech, Marx is the last humanist, which is very interesting, because he's aware of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and it has this kind of encounter, and so anyway, this starts off a whole chain, and of course the Frankfurt School never considered themselves humanists. The Dialectic of Enlightenment is published in 1947 in the United States. It's written 44, but it's published the same year, The Dialectic of Enlightenment.
So now, who said Marx is the last humanist? Was that
Heidegger.
Heidegger.
Yes.
The end of philosophy is Nietzsche and Marx.
Yeah.
Nietzsche and Marx marked two watersheds and the end of the line of philosophy.
The letter on humanism is by
Heidegger.
Heidegger.
yeah.
It's in response to Jean
Humanism.
Bouffray, a Christian philosopher, went to Heidegger, a good friend of Heidegger's, also a good friend of Jacques Lacan, went to Heidegger and said, "You've got to respond to Sartre's existentialism as a humanism, because I think he's distorting your thinking." So Heidegger, even though Sartre helped save him, Heidegger, after the war, wrote beautiful letters. He's not a Nazi pig, right? He still goes after him in this piece. Existentialism is humanism. So anyway, just to situate Adorno a little more, why still philosophy in 62, this is pretty much household, domesticated part of Frankfurt School, a particular French school and some of the Germans, right? And going on. In the U.S., we had no idea about this until the 1980s, right? Going on. This did not seep into any of the academies. I've searched far and, long for some kind of record of this in the American academies. Very little. So anyway, out of this is why still philosophy? This is the question. When Marx announces the death of philosophy, the point is to transform the world. Philosophy is praxis, right? One, the philosophy of praxis in Gramsci. You can see this in the humanist tradition. You see Lukacs and Korsch, who we're not going to obviously get to today, but, as part of that humanist tradition. Adorno, Heidegger, Althusser are all part of the anti-humanist tradition, and Adorno and Althusser particularly of the Marxist
Who
tradition.
said there was no philosophy in the French Enlightenment? You just mentioned that. You made a reference.
Well, Adorno was speaking about Kant. This was the end of philosophy as a discipline that happened in the German Enlightenment, in the Aufklärung. Yeah, in the Aufklärung.
So you said
Yeah.
that Adorno is part of the anti-humanist tradition,
Yes,
along
absolutely.
with Heidegger and
Althusser.
Althusser.
Yes. Yeah. So there's no more, quote unquote, the question, right, of us as, subjectivity, right? For Althusser, history is a process without a subject, right? History is capitalized, right, etc. For Heidegger, we are basically mere vessels of being. We're Dasein, we're their beings, but we're not really, quote, individuals or something like this. This is taken up in these new concepts like trans-individuality, singularity. All these kind of terms are extensions, if you will, of the thought of the anti-humanist tradition to situate it. So when you read people like Bernard Stiegler, Gilbert de Simondon, Jason Reed here in the States at the University of Southern Maine, these are all people that are taking up this anti-humanist strain. Yeah, please,
So-
I'm sorry, yeah.
So then,
Just
what
trying
do
to
they
situate
do
this
with
text a little
the
more, yeah.
question of the agent of change? What do they do with the question of subjectivity then, if this is not part of their philosophy?
Well, for Althusser, there's a structure and there is an agency at this point. That there really is only, you're just destructurating somewhat, and then there isn't one agent of history. Negre, who takes his point of departure from Althusser, the agent of history is a plurality of singularities called the multitude, right, in a way. So that's the new agency in that capacity. For Heidegger, it doesn't matter. There's no such thing as agency, right, in a way. We're preparing the way for a new revelation or a new, it almost has religious overtones, that, we're making the way for the new presencing, if you will, of being the old gods have died. We must prepare the way for, only a God can save us now, and that might not be enough either, right? In a sense, very pessimistic view of history. In the Nietzschean vocabulary, the agent of history is basically the Übermensch, but that is open to interpretation. If the Übermensch will overcome man, again, an anti-humanist concept, the Übermensch is the overcoming of man. Does this refer to forces, of manly? Or was the Übermensch a kind of Machiavellian virtue, as you pointed out, the virility, the new kind of virility that he's seeking? Is it also an overcoming of the patriarchy? Is he really, in a way, a kind of closet, kind of Bashafan in a way, where Mutterrecht is one way out, mother right, and et cetera? These are questions.
What does Foucault's Death of Man mean?
Death of Man is the man was an invention of philosophical anthropology.
It's the death of the author.
No, it's the death of man. Ends of man.
Something like that.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah,
one
the
of
death of man.
his tenets, one of his
Yeah.
last tenets, later tenets, I think,
Yeah.
That was
as I
the order
recall.
of things, which was
Yes.
fairly early.
Man is an invention of modern date,
Right.
but one nearing approaching his end, right? And he looks at this through the Kantian category of human finitude. Yeah, he's doing this as early as 1966, right? 66 is
So
order of things?
67.
67, yeah.
Concurrent to Althusser.
Yeah, and it appears, yeah.
Is it the same moment as Althusser too? Or is he?
Well, Reading Capital is 65 as the formation of the group, and the Center for the Epistemological Circle is 64. So all of this is going on, and Castieradas is writing about the radical imagination in the early 60s, 64. All we can do is teach and prepare.
Right.
We have no possibility of agency. So going back to your question about agent, the last agent is basically in this tradition, Lukacs and Korsch, who still think it's the proletariat.
It's a pessimistic point of view.
It is a pessimistic point of view, yeah. For Althusser, it's the structure determines, right? In a way, it's the structural Marxism at its best. It's like Levi-Strauss, structural anthropology is Kantian transcendental ego without a subject, right? You have no subject,
So what would that mean?
Transcendentalism really without the ego, yeah.
So it's more like institutions, educational systems.
Institutions, yeah, and also structural moments, right? And are there going to be glimpses of light or open doors within these that enable us to intervene? So you have the notion of the invisible subject, right, that comes out, that we're all invisible, in our machinations, kind of hidden agents here and there, in some ways, In Adorno's case, it's again, pushing the hyper-dialectic to the point of where there's no return. The last humanist Marxist, in my opinion, is Sartre. He said, Jean-Paul Sartre. The critique of dialectical reason is the last humanistic approach. I mean, to a degree, Lefebvre, but Lefebvre is more oriented towards everyday, and he's talking about the death of philosophy. Sartre says that philosophy is basically ended. There are only ideologies. There are no philosophies. That Marxism has not its philosophy fleshed out yet, and he makes this attempt in the critique of dialectical reason. I'd like one time that we do a long study of that, maybe in a couple of years, that's a remarkably, dense, but, energetic and, movement book,
What?
which, Sartre's book.
Sartre.
Yeah.
Did Marx himself say that philosophy is ideology? That's what philosophy is?
Well, I mean, in the German ideology, you
Right.
could see this playing out.
Right.
But, I don't know if he ever made that direct association.
Okay. So that was kind of put
Yeah,
out later.
yeah, I mean, it was Engels who wrote the book, The End of, German Idealism, right? Right, on classical German idealism. So Engels always had the task of doing the work in terms of on philosophy, whereas Marx was busy, writing Capital. And, the question for Marx really is that how much of this Hegelian, and philosophical background is playing out if philosophy is the invention of concepts, one, if philosophy is the concatenation of arguments historically, two, is philosophy intervention, three, does it intervene in the world at crucial times, and four, going back to your question about agency, for Adorno, and you can see this in this essay, philosophy has missed its moment because it has not been realized yet. And that's the agency, ultimately. Once we hit, philosophy will be finished once it's actualized in the world. And Labriola used to say, the revolution will be at the point of where everybody lives like Spinoza. This was Labriola, the Italian communist, used to write, Antonio Labriola. The revolution will be everybody will live everyday life like Spinoza. The blessed life. No, he didn't mean it that way. Yeah, but I like the way you got that good. I like this. Lukacs would love you. Yeah. Yeah. So the issue here is more that of whether the level of the abstraction, the movement of the abstract to the concrete in philosophy can be actually realized is one part of the question of agency, right? For them, the writing itself, the philosophizing itself becomes part of the agency. For Adorno, he thinks that the praxis is writing. And that he writes in such a way, I know you're laughing, but anyway, that he's thinking through, I don't want my thought to be co-opted. So that's the reason he writes the way he does.
He's under the
It's
illusion
like the
that he's
Thelonious Monk
writing
used to
it.
tell Mary Lou Williams, the pianist, right? The two pianists, great pianists that they're very, probably the two best. She would play downtown at Cafe Society, which was run by communists, by the way. Yeah. Right? At Cafe Society in Greenwich Village. Monk was in Minton's up in Harlem. So Monk would say, come up to Minton's later. It's bullshit downtown. We got to make music more complex so they don't understand this downtown. They're too bougie down there. We're just going to play music for Harlem. So Adorno is thinking this way too in terms of the writing. I don't want my thought to be co-opted. He does this on purpose. It's not just because he's being smart or acting. He's doing this on purpose where thought has to be worked through. And that to them, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this to them is that this is the praxis.
What was Georg's
The praxis.
excuse?
His excuse? Too many, people at every point.
Okay.
Yeah, that was his excuse, yeah. Yeah. You like Derrida?
Who?
Derrida.
What about him?
She's asked what his excuse was for writing the way
For
he
being
does.
unreadable.
But he's not unreadable. He's easy to read.
It's all lessons.
Jacques
isn't it?
Derrida?
Yeah.
What?
Well, that raises another question too, because
What like?
Derrida and Foucault are both post-Heideggerian, and in some ways they're tremendous remnants of Marx here. But does the methodology of deconstruction, was Marx the proto-deconstructivist? Is this Abbau, this undoing in German, unbuilding, of the phenomena, is Marx the proto-deconstructionist, or was Heidegger or Husserl before them, where you have these phenomenological reductions, or this hermeneutical phenomenology that uncovers things and lays bare structures, right, of which, I mean, they're all pretty much interrelated. I mean, this is why, I guess the history of philosophy is important, but
Deconstruction is not hermeneutic.
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
No, I said the Heidegger's hermeneutical phenomenology,
okay.
from Husserl's eidetic reduction, the phenomenological reduction. But these were all processes of undoing or of Abbau at work.
Heidegger was destruction, right?
No, they use deconstruction too. This is the word in German for deconstruction. Unbuild.
Bow?
Yeah, Bauder is to
Bauen
build.
means to build.
To build.
Verb, bauen.
You're unbuilding.
Bow.
Yeah.
Unbuild.
Yes. Deconstruire in the French, but that's how they translated this. But in German, where the term came from, it was to unbuilt. And this is what Marx does. This is what Lukacs is expert at. That's why I would like us to read, while I was thinking this through, this Wesen is not just an essence, because we get fixed in our reading habits, right, on certain concepts and categories, and we're kind of missing, if you will, the deconstruction at work.
Lukacs is hard, not
Yes,
Derrida.
I know. Well, okay.
You think Lukacs is harder than
See,
Derrida?
the lens grinder talks to the Derridian. Yeah, I like this. Yeah, this is a good short story. I like this.
Josh?
Yeah.
Yeah, if Michael is gonna stay there.
Yeah, it's okay.
No,
I'm
that's
sorry.
fine, that's great, 'cause you're,
Yeah.
but we're missing the.
Oh, yeah,
We're
I'm
missing the
sorry.
subject, it's just the blackboard.
I know.
It's just
Oh,
the subject.
the missing
The
subject, I
is,
love
the
it.
missing subject. So here's the
The
outline.
missing
Tell me about it.
Listen, we got a nice
Exactly.
email from some this guy at Carleton University, how good this stuff is, so that's good. Yeah, we got it, yeah. Yeah, please.
Stand over there.
Right, stand over here, I'm sorry. I like being close to, I gotta do this, yeah,
It's
go ahead.
getting on to 4:25.
Okay,
I'm just
okay,
giving you
all
a
right,
heads up.
okay, thank you so much. Okay, let me just make a couple of remarks, and I want to pick up with this on, you'll have a lot of time. I really want to go through this carefully, I'm sorry, but, I'm more accustomed to the 3 hours than the 2, so I apologize.
Five.
Or 5.
Like five.
You hear people? Okay, I'm sorry.
Pushing six,
Okay, I'm
pushing
sorry.
6 hours,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, yeah, too much, okay. So,
I don't know, when we go to,
You're
oh, I knew it was
you're
gonna be
addicted.
4 hours.
I'm addicted. Yeah, I'm addicted. That's true. Okay, so let me just point out on page 6, restoration, bottom of the page, about 10 lines up. Restoration is as futile in philosophy as is anywhere else. Philosophy has to protect itself from the chatter of culture and the abracadabra of worldviews. This is Heidegger right
Yeah,
here.
he hates
Idle
Heidegger.
talk, and he hates Heidegger. You know
He
how
does,
that
it's
goes.
petty the way he does
Yeah,
it too.
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It should be not imagined, and this is important, that specialized work in epistemological theory or whatever else prides itself in being research is actually philosophy. It's not, right? 99% of the philosophy departments, not doing philosophy according to Marx, Heidegger, Althusser, Adorno, Horkheimer, et cetera, right? Yet a philosophy forswearing all of that must in the end be irreconcilably at odds with the dominant consciousness. Always at odds with the dominant consciousness. Nothing else raises it above the suspicion of apologetics. Philosophy that satisfies its own intention and does not childishly skip behind its own history and the real one has its lifeblood in the resistance against the common practices of today, what they serve, and against the justification of what happens to be the case.
I love
Okay.
that. I love that sentence.
Yeah, it's very good to start there for next time on specialization. I won't keep you. I hear Beth here, and it's true. Yeah. So, but anyway, I want to just say this. Page 17, for those of you reading Benjamin or interested in Walter Benjamin on the concept of history, the last section, Rambaud's "It is necessary to be modern," or absolutely necessary to be modern, is neither an aesthetic program, this is page 17, the end of the essay, nor a program for aesthetes. It is a categorical imperative of philosophy. Whatever wants nothing to do with the trajectory of history belongs all the more truly to it. That's a very beautiful sentence. I mean, this is very smart. Whatever wants nothing to do with the trajectory of history belongs all the more truly to it, to history. History promises no salvation and offers the possibility of hope only to the concept whose movement follows history's path to the extreme. So you have this very beautiful hyper-dialectic at work here at the end. You want to say something?
Yeah.
This is a very beautiful, you can read this retrospectively back into why still philosophy, why the push. Yep. So anyway, we'll start with this, December 1st. I wish everybody a good Pilgrim's holiday. And no progress, as John Bunyan would have it. And
Is Peter coming?
Peter's coming, I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I can go another 2 hours, but I don't have the full-on sauce. Yeah, here we go.
reading Adorno.